Hi guys, my name is Katie Haynes. Today we are discussing intentional teaching. I guess I'm going to go first. So I teach K through 12 art, but currently my teaching position is 8th and ninth grade art. I'm in the junior high level. I'm so sorry if y'all can hear my dogs in the background. So my three ways that I have already found in my classroom that I really need to focus on as far as intentional teaching with my children would be making incredibly clear and detailed instructions, but short and concise, because my students, one, don't have the attention span to read every single bullet point for a huge art lesson. So I have to break it down into little segments as we go through the project and have handouts so that they can read it, but also show them at the front of the class exactly what we're going to be doing, and then walk around and monitor them while we're doing our projects, going step by step through each lesson, because most of the stuff that we do in my class is project-based learning. Currently we're making self-portraits, and we're doing reverse painting on acetate sheets, and words like that for my level area of students, they just go right over their heads, or they don't really know what I'm talking about. So I have to make it very specifically user-friendly for this age group as far as the vernacular goes. But I also have to consider their attention spans whenever I'm making the documents that they'll have at their desks to help them guide through it. But another thing that I've found that I really have to focus on is how this is going to be applicable as far as real life application, because a lot of kids that come into my class, the eighth graders are required to take it, and so they don't really see a point in having art. They don't really want to be there, and so I have to make it approachable for them and make it seem like it's important for them to have. And so I have to give them real world application as far as the content that we're going over, so that they don't just zone out and I'll lose them. And then the third thing would be monitoring them throughout the day and making sure that by asking pointed questions and doing a really strong assessment afterwards, that they're picking up the information that I was wanting them to get, that my teaching and the lessons coincided well enough that the assessment will show that they grasped all of the content. And so I need to I feel like it's really hard in art classes, or at least so far, I feel like my assessment is one thing that I really need to up in my classroom, because my students, they do rubrics, they do artist statements, and then they have to present their artwork, but sometimes I feel like they're not really grasping how the concepts apply to their artwork and how they can use that problem solving in their real world application of what they gain from my class. So I have to be very intentional whenever I'm making these lessons to both keep them focused but also help them retain the information. So.
Okay, I am Kelly Thomas, and I teach third grade math and science. I think a way that I can be an intentional teacher in my subject area is making sure every student is engaged. I think that can become the hardest part with math. It's really hard for students to see a bunch of numbers and try and make sense of it. So, for instance, one of the engaged lessons I have in my class is for fractions. We do the Hershey bar fraction lesson, where it's really hands-on, and they just seem to grasp it better because the Hershey bars separated into different pieces. So it's a really cool hands-on way to engage them. And then piggybacking off of that, I try and be intentional with each student's learning style, because I know specifically for me, I was a visual person. Teachers could stand at the front of the classroom and talk all day long, but if I didn't see a visual, I was not going to process what they just told me. So I think it's important to always have that visual aspect, or somehow be catering to students' learning styles, because I think that's like the easiest thing a teacher can learn about a student when they're building that relationship with them, is what does this student, what is their learning style going to be? Are they going to be, you know, do they need to be up and moving? Are they a visual person? Are they a hands-on person? So I try and keep that. And I just think it's important when you're a teacher and you're intentional to take the time to get to know your students one-on-one and maybe understand why is it that they're not grasping this, you know, have they ever been exposed to this before, or things like that. So that's what I think being an intentional teacher in my subject field is.
Hey, I'm Chelsea Berry. I teach 4th grade math and science, so I'll be piggybacking off of Kelly a little bit. For me, in my content area, being intentional can often be a challenge, but I feel like, you know, with good intent, I have good results, so it's super important. So just a few things, making clear goals for students so that they understand what they're working towards helps to be intentional. I think every student needs to not only have clear instructions, like you said, Caitlin, but also understands clearly what the end result is, or what the goal for them is, so that, you know, they're propelled through kind of the lesson as well as the activities. They understand, you know, what they're working towards. Secondly, I think it's super important teaching. By that I mean you're not just getting up and, you know, understanding that you've got to meet your curriculum, but also teaching not necessarily the academic areas of students' lives, but all areas. So encompassing all of those things and making sure each lesson is purposeful to not just an academic layer of learning, but all layers of learning. And then lastly, you know, my first were geared more towards students, geared more towards us teachers. And I think it's super important when being intentional, we are intentional about continuing our education. So we're always looking for opportunities to better ourselves, and, you know, in return, that will better our students. So I think it's very important to have good intentions and to be intentional about looking for opportunities to continue our learning and our education as well. So yeah, that's what I got.
Okay, my name's Emily. My content is middle school math. So how I think I should implement or be an intentional teacher in my content, I think just making sure that I implement creative lessons. I know a lot of students just think they're not good at math, and so it makes them not want to work harder and not have a good work ethic in your class. So implementing creative lessons that not only relate back to other subjects and real life, that helps them a lot if it relates back to real life, to where they get interested in it. But also, I think the most important thing to be an intentional teacher is just instilling a love for math or whatever subject you're teaching in your students. Because I know in middle school, they're starting to get into some of the more difficult content, and they're about to get into even more difficult. So it's really important that if we instill a love for math, they'll be able to build on that in future grades. And then three or four specific behaviors I have for my classroom is using formative and summative assessments to fuel my instruction, not only for the future years, but also for your specific individual students and your entire class as a whole. And then observing and modifying. If you notice that one type of teaching style isn't working for your class, change it in the middle of the semester or the middle of the year. And then I encourage math talk and math writing. A lot of times students know how to complete a formula or a specific calculation, but they don't know why. And for me, if I knew the why, it made it a lot easier to grasp it for the future and connect it to other related topics. So I encourage math talk and writing. And then lastly, just offering choices to students on a specific assignment or which direction we're going to learn this material in. If the students are offered a choice and they play a role in their learning and they're active in their and they invest in their learning, they're more likely to work harder and to be more excited to come to your class. And I know math class, a lot of students dread it. So if you can get them excited, they'll learn and they'll retain that information a lot more. So that's what I have.
Awesome.
I noticed from everybody talking that everybody was really into giving the why to their students, like when they're an intentional teacher. And I just thought that was really cool, because I think it's students need to clearly see, like, why am I working towards this goal? Like, what's the bridge between this class and using it here and using it in the real world or outside of school, not the real world.
Mhm.
I think everyone also really had a focus on differentiation for learning styles and being willing to adapt. I think that's, although we can be so intentional in our planning and how we think that we're going to teach it best, but being adaptive as well can be a part of it. Being very receptive to the ways that your students learn best and the things that really hit home with them, and whenever you see something working with them, following that and taking that route instead of saying, well, this is where I'm comfortable teaching at. I know that you learn better that one specific way, but this is where I'm comfortable being adaptable and being willing to change for them. If they're, you said something, Kelly said something about being a visual learner and needing that aspect. And Emily said something about, changing in the middle of the semester. That sounds really scary to me because I'm a kinesthetic and a visual learner. And if I have primarily auditory learners in my classroom, that would definitely be a huge switch for me to go and teach that way. But if I needed to, it would be worth it for my students to be there,
I think it's important to teach your students. Like, that's the biggest way you can be intentional.
Yeah. So I feel like we had a lot of commonalities whenever we were going through what we would do in our specific areas. What do we think our overarching definition for intentional teaching would be, just from what we think is important in our content areas?
I mean, I feel like everyone, the one thing that I heard, like you said, from everyone was individualized teaching. So definitely, I think for all of us, it's super important to us that we're looking at each student as an individual and not just as a whole class, because that's really when you can grow, or you can see student growth, is when, you're taking an individualized approach. So definitely, first and foremost, individualized teaching or individualized instruction.
Yeah. I think a teacher's ability and willingness to follow what her students need and to be aware of their unique circumstances and their habits and the way that they learn, and being able to adapt that and to really bond with their children, I think is probably something that came across for all of us. And planning and being prepared, but also being willing to adapt and change. I feel like that's.
I think an intentional teacher just needs to be really deliberate in every action and decision we have, because if you want to be an intentional teacher, but you only show it half the time in half of your lessons, I don't think it's going to work. I think you need to be purposeful and deliberate in every single thing you do each day in the classroom. And I think you also need to think about the long-term learning and your goals for your class and each student, because we need to relate each lesson and relating that to the students to how this goes into our long-term goals for them and for their entire education.
Yeah. I think we're all on the same page. Yeah, I think we're pretty much there.
And even through all of the different subject levels or subjects and grade levels, like, I feel like you can be intentional across the board.
Yeah. And I feel like it translates even for me in my art classes. I still think about ways that, I can relate it back to science or math. And we have a really strong push in our school district for literacy as well. And so in my classroom, I have to think about ways whenever I'm teaching or planning out my lesson plans to be intentional, not only to teach them my content area, but how it can transfer over. And so I think it's really cool to hear how closely all of our ideas on this align. So
For sure.
Awesome.
What else?
I think we wrapped it up.
I think that's about it. Yeah.
Hey, y'all, I'm
Awesome.
in the recording right now. So
Okay.
just so y'all know.